So my methodological specialty is interviewing and focus groups. And I have a number of years of conducting both of these methods of data collection. But when I started, I had no idea what I was doing. I got pulled into a project, and I realized that what I had understood that I was supposed to be doing was not actually what was happening. So like one of my first articles was actually like just a reflection on the fact that I was completely clueless. I had no freaking idea what I was doing. And I started to realize that a lot of it was because of the ways that I was posing the interview questions. If any of you have not ever conducted interviews, I will tell you, generally speaking, participants give you verbally exactly what you asked for. And what I learned was that what I was asking for was not actually what I was hoping to get. And so that was educative for me. So this workshop is going to, in many respects, like really examine the refining of the tool itself, the actual questioning technique, so that when you engage with people in interviews, you're getting responses that align with what you're hoping to learn and collect. Because what you ask the participants is what they're going to give you, and that's sometimes great, and so that's sometimes a problem. I have done a good bit of interviewing and focus group interviews for a range of government agencies, and I've interviewed in facilities for incarcerated and detained people. I've interviewed in schools. I've interviewed in not schools. I've interviewed children, that's a whole different level. I know my strengths, and that's not necessarily one of them. But that is to say that if you've got a particular interview interest or a particular interview concern, feel free at the end. I'm going to try to leave room for you to ask questions. And those who know me know, like, I'm very candid about my strengths and my weaknesses. And if I don't know something, or if I've not done something well, I will own that and explore that relative to your question. Okay, so the first thing is, I want to start this because I know whenever I do these workshops, I end up with people who are all over the spectrum relative to research methods. Those who have had my classes in qualitative research can attest. I feel very confident and comfortable in saying, like, many of them can say whether I'm lying or not. I am not at all an anti-quant person. I am very much of the stance that quantitative and qualitative research are designed to answer different kinds of questions. They answer different sorts of research questions. They are able to accomplish different sorts of research goals. They sometimes work very well together in mixed methods. Sometimes one or the other is just better equipped to accomplish something. And so qualitative research is well equipped relative to just the slipperiness and the fluidity and flexibility of people talking through experiences, talking through understandings. And so, oh, Mona, I wish that you had, like, because we could have shared the PowerPoint with them whilst. So we're not coming at this as like quantitative versus qualitative, because I don't think that's productive. I think that's a counterproductive approach to research. And so for any of you who are like, I don't really like qual because it's messy and gross, because that is often what I get, especially in qual 1. This is simply an additional tool in a toolbox. That is very much the way that I'm understanding it. And so there's certainly a number of fully quantitative studies that employ interviewing. Those are different kinds of questioning techniques from what I'm going to explore today, but I can talk more about that at the end if you'd like for me to. No one here needs to be on high alert or be defensive, because that is not my goal. In terms of the talk itself, I've only got 2 hours. Usually this workshop lasts 3 to 4, so this is going to be like high speed. And people always question my southernness. I've always grown up in the South, but I talk really quickly. So I'm just telling you, like, you can question my southernness, but it's going to be some quick talking today. The first is, I'm going to look very specifically at the sorts of research questions that quantitative research is designed to answer, and then look at the sorts of questions that qualitative is designed to answer, because that is part of understanding whether or not interviews are the right method. A lot of times students will come and they'll say, like, I want to do interviews, but then they'll start talking about what they want to learn, and I'm like, well, actually a survey is probably the best way to get at that. Or, you know, actually, like, the way that you're phrasing that, observations are really the only way that you're going to be able to answer that question. And so one of the things that a lot of times researchers are sort of expected to know is how to align methods with research questions, but there's never necessarily explicit instruction on how to do that work. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the sorts of questions that the two different approaches to research answer, so that you can begin to think about, like, well, maybe I do have a situation where I'm going to have to employ some qualitative interviewing, or, you know, I'm glad I learned about this, but in fact my questions are much better designed in some sort of other approach. And then the last is you're actually going to do some qualitative interviewing, for better or for worse. Some of you are going to realize that you're really good at it, and some of you are going to be like, this is a lot harder than Oprah made it look. So the first is quantitative research is generally, by virtue of like it working to quantify things, it is generally interested in questions of how many or how often, how regularly something happens, and then also looking at like how do particular demographics, particular groups respond to things. Those are very useful questions for a lot of social justice oriented research, and a lot of my qualitative research is in fact based on quantitative findings in relation to demographic responses of different groups. There are typically integrations of numerical data, statistics, measurable data, because these are the sorts of sources that help to answer these sorts of questions. And then a lot of times, most of the time, quantitative research is relying on large data sets because there's a goal of generalizability. And in order to be able to responsibly answer a question like how often does something happen, you need to be able to demonstrate through the size of the data collection that this is something that is believable, this is reliable, my findings are something that you can trust. Patterns are often found through numbers, and this is important because qualitative is also very interested in patterns, but it's a different sort of pattern making. And I mention that simply to say that some of the skills that are implicit in one are also very valuable and important in the other. Data collection samples often will include things like surveys, polls, systematic observations where you have like particular things that you're looking for. A lot of schools, if any of you do like school-based work, a lot of times there are quantitatively based observation instruments that are used there, for example, and I've done that sort of work. And often there's software that can be used to help facilitate this work. I will say that sometimes people who are trained quantitatively come to Qual and then they download qualitative software and they're like, but it's not doing anything. And I'm like, it just holds your data. You do all the work. It doesn't do anything except hold that data. And so that's always a little heartbreaking for people because they're like, it won't go. And it's like, it will not. It will not. Especially people coming from a post-positivist perspective, and this is not all quantitative researchers, there's a strong emphasis on objectivity and trying to work to either eliminate bias depending on what paradigm they're coming from, or potentially just trying to mitigate bias, because that's one of the ways that you convince people that what you have found, that you are arguing, is in fact valid, is believable, is trustworthy. But that's not universal, I want to make really clear. And then there's a pretty strong emphasis, especially in lab-based sciences, but not entirely, on this reproducibility. Qualitative research has no expectation of reproducibility. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. But here's the thing, interviewing can help with some of these items, but interviewing is not really equipped to answer a lot of these things, because the fact is interviewing is a very contextualized, very fluid, and very human-based enterprise. And any of you who have done human subjects research know you have no control over what humans are going to do. And so interviewing is sometimes used in quantitative research, but it's used in a way that is more aligned with like almost like verbal surveys. And that's not what we're going to be doing today. But these are the sorts of questions and goals that quantitative is designed to do quite well. Qualitative research doesn't do those things well. Qualitative research is much more focused on the who and the why. The why is a big part of qualitative research. And quantitative is not necessarily equipped to answer that why. Quantitative research is equipped to answer the who sometimes, and is certainly equipped to answer questions like how many or how often or to what degree. Qualitative research, it's more of the messier why. And that's something that a lot of times you have to basically talk to people about. And this is one of the things, it's very common for people to employ survey research to get the surveys back. And this is often how I get pulled into government contract work, in fact, because they will do large-scale surveys and then they'll realize they're getting really problematic responses to a particular item, or people will type like their 3-word response to like a short answer item, and they're like, we need more in-depth understanding of these particular items. And so this is a why. And so as an example, there was a government agency that was evaluating teaching, and one of the questions they kept asking students was the educational program rigorous? And the students continuously said no, like without fail, no, it's not rigorous. And so they would continuously do all this teacher training and be like, we got to be more rigorous, we got to more rigor. And the teachers are like, the next thing is like chains and whips. Like, what are we supposed to do here? Like, what's the next step? And so they finally realized that the quantitatively based research was not giving them all of the, not giving them a full, complete picture. And so they brought me in and they're like, can you fix, make work? And so I sat down with kids and asked them, when you hear the word rigor, what do you think? What is something, when you hear that word, what comes to mind when you hear that? And the answer was the kids were thinking that rigor was related to testing, to standardized testing. And so when they were asking these kids about the rigor of instruction, this was a program that was working to decenter standardized testing, to decenter standardized instruction. And so the kids were like, no, it's not rigorous. And the kids thought that was a good thing because it wasn't standardized. But then the program was like, we're not challenging these children. And in fact, it just was simply, it was just a matter of different understandings of a concept. And so once they had that understanding, they didn't need me anymore. They pulled me out and they changed the survey instrument. And then it was something along the lines of did this program help you to learn differently or to think differently? And then it was 99+% yes, absolutely. And so it's a why sort of question. There are patterns, but the patterns tend to be much more individually based. They're at the individual level. How many times does a particular person respond in a particular way? And as many of you know who have sat through Qual 1, there's a strong digging into researchers' subjectivities. Qualitative research is emphatic that you can't leave who you are on the cutting room floor. And so you bring all that baggage with you to any sort of interaction, including an interview, and it's going to matter. And there's a lot of articles on this topic. For a long time, especially back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a strong emphasis in qualitative interviewing if we want to make sure that the interviewer looks like the people that we're interviewing. And what they found over time was that still was a really simplistic and problematic assumption, was that just by virtue of someone looking like someone else, they were going to interact with them as if they knew them. And so there are lots of examples in qualitative scholarship of the ways that who a researcher is going to play a role in the interviewing setting, even if it's unintentional, even if it's something that you've worked to mitigate. And so qualitative research has an expectation that you dig into that and think about that. And so that's one of the functions, frankly, of Qual 1. You have to do that work, and it's messy and gross and uncomfortable sometimes, but it's an expectation for qualitative research. And if you've ever read qualitative publications, you'll often see something along the lines of a subjectivity statement or a positionality statement or whatever, and that's what that's doing, is thinking about how are you as a researcher mattering in terms of the ways that you're interacting, because your participants read you. You read your participants, but your participants read you, and the ways that they read you shape the ways that they choose to interact with you. And sometimes that's even just on a subconscious level, but it matters. And so your responsibility as a qualitative researcher is to think about that before, during, and after. All right, so some examples of quantitative questions. There was a survey that regarded how repair technicians were trained and able to train others about safety, and so some questions that Quant was well designed to answer was how many training sessions were appropriate relative to them being able to indicate that they felt trained, they felt prepared. How many of them believed that these courses were actually useful? And we do a lot of these sorts of surveys for the university. I do anyway, and if I don't do them, I get 3 other reminders in my inbox telling me that I've not done them. And then 3 more. Another is a question of like trends indicating the effectiveness of technology in science education. This sort of question is very common in educational research, and in fact, this sort of question is one of the ones that will inform and drive a lot of qualitative research, because one of the things that quant does very well is because of its examination of large-scale patterns, it helps you to pay attention to trends across like particular demographics, particular sorts of school districts, particular sorts of instructional strategies, particular intervention programs, and then qual can come in and sort of dig into like, all right, so what are their responses, like why is it working this way in this school versus why is it not working as well in this school. And then another example is relative to like education, like why does one nation's approach, like how is it different or how does it compare to a different nation's approach? And you see this a lot in a lot of like reports on education, like you'll see like, you know, Finland, you know, this many students, blah, 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 blah. Whereas in the US, we suck and we only do this, blah, 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 blah. And it's not that like the suck is not the good thing, but it's that quantitative research is designed to examine multiple sites of questioning, multiple sites of information gathering, and to create larger pictures. And that's simply not qual's role. It doesn't do that work. And so if you're looking for big picture sorts of findings, qualitative research is not the answer. That's not its function. That is definitely something that quant does very well. Qual is something, you're going to see these questions are much more specific and much more dug into like a particular context, a particular individual. How effective is an educational instructor's curriculum in a particular context? That's a far smaller scale question than the ones that I just showed you. How do instructors understand students' cognitive processes as effective in health sciences learning? And so this is very specifically like a group of instructors in a particular setting in relation to a particular aspect of students' learning. That's much more specific. Quantitative could answer this question as part of a larger sort of scale. This is a question more along the lines of like, why do they, how do they? And so it's a much more deliberately specific and much more deliberately honed in, focused set of questions. And then how does an adjunct juvenile justice education instructor understand and describe her experiences? This is a very common sort of phrasing of interview questions in qualitative research. Things relative to participants' understandings, things relative to participants' descriptions of things, because those are things that qualitative interviewing are well equipped to do. Surveys are not built to have people give space to describe things. Surveys are not built to give space for people to explain their understandings. We've all engaged with a survey at some point in time where we're like, well, it's not really any of these, but I guess I'm going to go with this, right? And so qualitative research's function is to say, okay, so describe those things, explain your understandings. Why do you feel that way? And so these are different sorts of questions. And that's always really important, because if you think you're going to do interviews, you need to be deliberate about how is an interview actually going to help answer the sets of questions that you're coming to the table with. So, qualitative interviewing. Here's one thing that I think will make all of you happy, I think. All of you, just by virtue of the way that most verbal cultures work, have an innate set of skills that predispose you to be pretty good at interviewing. There's been a lot of studies of this. The majority of cultures across the globe that have a verbal vocabulary have sets of cultural norms and sets of normative interactions that predispose us to be people who question for explanation and understanding, and predispose us to be storytellers. And so the cultural norms that we are all likely to come to this space with are going to equip you to already be like really good qualitative researchers, qualitative interviewers. So you're all already like at least intermediate level without even trying. You're welcome. The other thing is, qualitative interviewing is a huge component of qualitative research. Over 60% of qualitative research is interview-based. And that's a substantial amount of just talking to people. And one of the reasons for that is because although qualitative interviewing is also although qualitative research is very invested in things like ethnographic observations, personal autoethnographic and autobiographical reflections, document-based explorations, focus group explorations, because this does not include focus groups, by the way. The reality is, a lot of times, the best way to get at a research question is just to talk to people, just to ask them. And there's a lot of different topics and questions that sitting in a group of people and asking that set of questions is not really the best way to do it. There are a number of times when we feel much more comfortable talking to someone like one-on-one than we do sitting in a group and talking about a particular thing. And generally speaking, culturally, we're predisposed to talk more at length if we're not sharing that verbal space with a group of people as well. And so individual interviewing is also a method that because of our cultural norms, predisposes people to just talk more. Because when you're in focus groups, people are more mindful of sharing verbal space. And so if you want to get a lot from a particular individual, it's really best to just sit down with them individually. And so it's not a coincidence that over 60% of qualitative research is individual interview based. So you have a good space. All right, so why would you interview then? Given our research questions, you're looking specifically at personal individual accounts or experiences of something. And those personal individual accounts or experiences are going to add to some sort of understanding that you have, some sort of question that you were trying to answer. You could use interviewing because you need specifics to help better contextualize or understand the generalizable. And a good example of this was the one I gave you of the students responding to the rigor question. They needed specifics to help better contextualize and understand that item. And so that's what happened. And then again, sometimes important information can only be conveyed through talking about it. You can't see it when you observe. You can't or you're not gonna respond relative to like a survey where you click or you have like a box where you type. We all know there are moments when we just call somebody because like it's just easier to tell this to you than to try to email it. And so sometimes that's just what interviewing does. Sometimes it's just easier just to talk. For you and for the participants, right? So there's lots of different kinds of interviews, and I want to be really emphatic about that. Sabrina heard this last night, bless her heart. But there's lots of different kinds of interviews. We're going to do a particular kind of interview today because it is a good, solid, multi-purpose approach to qualitative interviewing. But I want to be really clear, and I also want to say as a side note and plug for those of you who are faculty and or students, in the fall I'm going to be teaching BER 636, which is qualitative interviewing. It's a whole semester of qualitative interviewing. And we delve into these different types of approaches. And so if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm not going to go into this list, but I will say that there's lots of different kinds of qualitative interviews that get at particular aspects of different kinds of research questions. And so for example, if you're working very hard to answer questions relative to like cultural norms, cultural understandings, cultural experiences, ethnographic interviews are specifically built and equipped to ask people relative to cultural norms, cultural spaces. And so one of the things I'm going to say is if you're going to do interviews, at least do some work, some leg work, if you will, some research work, and make sure that you have an understanding of the type of interview that is the best approach. And if you choose to use focus groups, to be thoughtful about whether or not having a group of people talk about a particular topic is going to make sense or not, because there are moments when having lots of people is going to really inspire and spark a lot of conversation, and there are moments when having lots of people is going to shut people down and they're going to be less inclined to talk. So we're going to do phenomenological interviewing, all right? And here's why. First of all, it sounds real fancy, so you can like use it to impress your friends. That's the first thing, and it's the most important. But also, phenomenological interviewing necessitates open-ended questioning. Hello. A lot of times, including myself, when people begin to engage in interviews, we have a tendency to ask very straightforward questions. And the issue with that is, at the beginning I said, participants give you exactly what you asked for. And if you ask them a closed question, like a yes or a no, or just a straightforward answer, so I don't know, tell me about when you enrolled in your doctoral studies. They're just going to tell you about that. That's literally what they're going to tell you about. Like, well, I applied, I got accepted, and then I got an assistantship. That's what you're going to get. Participants give you exactly what you asked for. This is an approach to interviewing that forces you to ask open-ended questions, and the advantage of that is that it gives them space to answer in a range of ways. So that you're not having, because the thing is, if you ask a lot of closed questions, you're going to have to do a lot more work as an interviewer. Because you're going to ask a question, they're going to give you a very short answer, and you're going to be like, well, I thought that was going to go longer, but it didn't. So then you're going to have to ask another question, they're going to give you another short answer, and you're going to be like, geez, this is not going well at all. Then you're going to be in panic mode, all the systems are going to be shutting down, it's going to be really ugly. If you ask open-ended questions, they're doing the talking, and then the next part of it is, you just get to listen. You get to listen, and then you listening to them is the way that you drive the interview. And that's very productive for you because you get to decide what, based on what they're saying, because you know what your research questions are, you know what your research purposes are. Based on what they're saying, you get to decide what parts of what they're saying are going to be like the follow-up. But it's useful for them because then they feel heard. And plenty of research has shown us that if participants feel like you are listening to them, that you hear them, they are much more inclined to give you very detailed responses. Nothing frustrates a participant more than you asking them something they've already answered, and they will tell you right quick, well, I already answered that. And then it's going to shape the rest of the interview because they're going to feel like you're not paying attention to them. So this is an approach to interviewing that forces you to listen. It also forces you, frankly, to shut up. Because some of us are very talkative, and one of the issues that some people have as interviewers is that we're so busy being like, oh my God, me too, that it turns into like you're on Oprah's couch instead of actually doing a research interview. And that's not what you want. It relies on follow-up questions, and this is part of the active listening, and I'm going to model this for you in just a second. It also encourages narrative-based responses. And narrative-based responses, first of all, I mentioned earlier, we are culturally, globally predisposed to be storytellers. If you give people spaces where you're basically inviting them to tell stories, they're going to give you enormous amounts of data. And that is ultimately, in many respects, that is the goal of most research, to try to collect as much information as possible so that you can learn as much as possible. And so asking them questions that encourage narrative-based responses, give them opportunities to talk at length about something so that you're not having to drive the interview so actively, and they get to have a very active space in that interview. I want to be really clear, there's not really a way to erase power dynamics in interviews. I don't care how meticulous and careful you are, because at the end of the day, you're still the one who gets to decide the research question, the research purpose, the interview questions. You're the one who gets to decide what the follow-up questions are. You're the one who's going to get to do the data analysis. Even if you do member checking, you're still the one who's driving the show, if you will. It's still your show. So you're not fixing those power dynamics, but you are creating a dynamic where they feel like what they are saying is valued, is attended to, and is important. And participants feed off of that. If they feel like you're listening to them and that you're engaged, they're gonna they will do so much verbally. And they'll even do things like, well, is that what you wanted? Or I want to make sure I'm giving you what I want. And those are human cues to tell you that they're very invested in wanting to basically do a good job. And the reason that's important is because it tells you that they feel like this interview interaction is valuable to them and they want it to be valuable to you. You don't want them to feel like they have like particular things they need to do a good job, but like they will say those sorts of things that they feel like you're hearing them, you're paying attention to them. So, I need a volunteer. And I know a lot of you, so I will call on someone if necessary.
I showed up late, so
Great! Hooray! Okay, all right. Can I borrow a sheet of your paper, Bezod? You're a good human. I don't care what your friends say. Hey, you're so good, thank you. This is like part 2, isn't it? Okay, all right, we can just sit over here, that'll be fine. All right, so if this were like an actual IRB interview, you would go through the consent process as a responsible person, because that's what you should do. You thank them for their time. I would encourage you to find a quiet space, because if you've never done interviewing, I will tell you, choosing to meet in a place like a coffee shop sounds like an amazing idea, so chill, so cool, espresso, until you start transcribing it. And then you know how many times the espresso machine got used, but you don't know what the 4th word in that sentence was. A quiet space. So thank you so much for your time. I'm very appreciative. And I'm going to be taking notes during, if that's okay with you?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I want you, if you would, to think of a moment, because you're a doctoral student.
Yes.
I want you to think of a moment in your doctoral studies that you felt empowered, okay? Let me know when you have that moment in mind.
I felt empowered.
Mm-hmm.
I think that personally, I try to find that feeling every day, because I think you can get bogged down a lot when you're in this program or in any doc program. And so I make weekly checklists of the things that I have to do and by when. So just simply like marking off those things every single day, I feel very empowered by going through lists of things I have to do, from turning in assignments to doing my GA work. That feels really good. So that's like my self-empowerment, but I feel very empowered anytime I interact with my faculty members and the professors that teach me during the weekly classes, whether that's simply them listening is empowering and hearing me out, and also practicing active listening while we're just having a conversation. So it's not like they're just waiting for me to stop so I can keep talking. So it's humanizing me. I'm not just a student or another body in this program. It's a way that you interact with your students, I think, is empowering.
Okay, so you mentioned feeling heard by faculty members and them actively listening to you and humanizing you. Could you think of like a particular example of that and tell me about that?
Well, so I'm from Ohio. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. So, I mean, I don't have family and I don't know anyone in the South. So I moved down here not knowing anyone. So I'm however many miles away from my family. My dad's aging. He's pretty sick right now. So my faculty members learned that about me within the first month that I was here on campus. And every single time before we sit down to do business in a meeting, they ask me how my dad is and how my family is. So I know they're listening and they really care about me, not just about the work that I'm producing.
And then you mentioned these checklists, and I identify, I'm also a very enthusiastic marker offer of things. So is there a particular item that you can recall on a list that you were just like, yes?
Oh, yeah. I think I took prelims last spring. So the series of essays that we had to write, very similar to comps in our program. So we took those last spring. Hitting the submit button on that was both liberating and a little scary, but it felt good to get it done.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to break fourth wall because I want to make sure that you all have time. So here's the thing. All right, so let me ask. So I only had one interview question that was actually an official interview question, and that was to think of a moment that she felt empowered, okay? So then the rest of the questions were based entirely on what you said. And I want to ask as a very open question. I'm not fishing for answers because that drives me bananas when people do that. What are some things that I use to ask those questions of her?
You use words that she used.
So I'm referring back to specific things that she said. So I'm not just pulling things out of the air, and I'm making it very clear that I'm hearing you and that I'm interested in learning more about something that you said. That's important, not only because it's important because it holds you accountable as an interviewer, because it makes you pay attention, but it's also important because, I'm going to reiterate what I've already said, when participants feel like you're paying attention to them, they give you better quality information. If they feel like you're just mining for answers and data, they're going to start giving you very short, monosyllable, fragment sentence sort of responses. They're not going to be nearly as invested in the interaction, and frankly, they shouldn't be. If they feel like they're not being heard and they're not being respected, and you're not using their time well, then they don't owe you anything. And I want to say, whenever people show up, this is true for anything, surveys, interviews, whatever. But when people show up to give you information for your research, regardless of the mode, they're doing you a favor, and your big $10 Starbucks gift card or whatever is still not nearly as valuable to them as you needing their responses. And so using their responses as a way to drive the conversation. I'm also not picking random stuff, I'm keying in on particular things that seem important to you. But if my goal is to try to understand empowerment in doctoral studies, there's also other things that it's just really not very productive to explore, to go off on. And so, for example, this idea of your dad not being well, that's something that it's very personal for you to share, and that says something to the degree of like when participants share personal things, that you're helping to create an environment where they feel comfortable enough to do so. But following up on that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense if my goal is to understand like forms of empowerment in doctoral studies. I could bring it up in relation to like, again, like you being heard by faculty, you being cared for by faculty. That could be a way I could bring it up. But to just get her to talk about her dad just doesn't make a whole lot of sense given the research purpose that I'm exploring, okay? Sabrina, I'm gonna ask you, because I know you already know, so it's like a cheat code. What about my interactions?
So your body language, was very open, right? But you didn't give a lot of verbal responses back to her, but you did nod your head.
And I'm going to interrupt and ask, because like we are naturally inclined, y'all know the answer to this too, but we're naturally inclined to do a lot of continuers. That's what they're called verbally, like We're just naturally inclined to do that. I've trained myself not to do that in interviews. Why not? I don't want to transcribe it. I mean, at some point, there's just a practical element to it, and it's important for you to realize, like, you don't have to engage in those aspects of interaction, even though they're a natural, normal part of interaction, because there's ways to communicate through body language. Like, I'm very invested in you. Plus, I'm gonna refer specifically back to things that you said. So you're not wondering, like, are you listening to me? Are you paying attention? I am, but I'm also not having to transcribe all of my mm-hms and ohs, because I'm going to tell you what, you don't realize how much of that you do until you're having to type it. The first time I wanted to throw myself out of a window, just like Stephanie. Stop the madness. Okay, yes?
So you said you didn't pick up random things she said?
Yes?
Like she said immunizing.
I did write that down.
You purposefully chose her to elaborate on that thing, right? So does that mean that the interview is still open-ended, or is kind of semi-structured?
It's semi-structured. It's also, the questions are open-ended because I'm letting her decide how she's going to approach this. So like, tell me about a checklist where you mark something off. Tell me about, so those are open-ended questions because it's letting her decide how to answer them. But it is semi-structured in that so semi-structured, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is structured in that I have a research purpose, a research question that's driving my intentional questioning. It's also structured in that I have at least one interview question to interact with you with, but it's semi-structured because the rest of the follow-up questions are based on things that you are saying. And so whenever you tell IRB, like I'm doing a semi-structured interview, like that's what you mean, is I've got some structure in place, but I'm also going to like have some follow-up questions, some probing questions, if you will. And it's open-ended in that like I'm allowing her space to decide how she's going to answer it. And sometimes participants will decide they're not going to answer something, and that's also their right. That's something they're afforded as a right. Other questions before I put you to work? Yes?
One question, I'm pretty unfamiliar with this.
It's not a natural mode of interaction for sure. Like no one walks around just like, so tell me about.
I sat in on a PhD defense of somebody who did qualitative methods. They taped everybody. Is that common?
It's pretty common just because the transcription of those audios becomes, in many cases, the data. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you're in environments where like things like digital recorders aren't allowed. Sometimes it's not possible because the participant simply is not willing to be recorded. Sometimes it's not possible because the device fails and doesn't work, because that's what technology does sometimes. But it's pretty common, it's fairly standard practice to audio record. There are also people who video record. There are even transcription conventions to transcribe like the ways that people like, move their eyes and move their body and so on. I don't do that work, frankly, but there are lots of people who do. But I will also say, for those of you who are potentially considering interviewing, one of the things when you're filling out, like for example, an IRB application, one of the check boxes is that you're going to do like audio recordings of interviews. Like that's actually like a box that you check because it is such a standard convention in conducting interviews. I will say that some people seem to approach digital audio recording as like I don't need to remember things because now I've got it recorded. And the reality is that recorder is not sorcery. It's just a digital recorder. It's not going to capture everything. There's stuff that you're going to have to remember for yourself. And there's also moments when, and I will also say it's like this is a tangent of sorts, but it's still related. I don't use paid transcriptionist services because, so first of all, I have some ethical concerns in handing raw data to a stranger. And most of the time, participants are not aware that that's going to happen. When people use paid transcriptionist services, that's often not a part of the consent process. Is, oh, by the way, I'm going to take this unanonymized data and hand it to this random person, and they're going to transcribe it for me. And if you're going to use a transcriptionist service, I think that needs to be a part of the consent form, that they know that. But the other parts of it is transcriptionists are not there. So they lack context, and they get a lot of stuff wrong. And so I was part of a grant project, and we were talking to English teachers, and one of them kept referring to like Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and they were referring to like particular tales, and the transcriptionist got all that just horribly wrong. But I mean, it's like, I mean, this paid transcriptionist is clearly not like a medieval, literature aficionado, and so then we had to basically go back through and wade back through that audio data to fix that stuff, because we needed that information, because we were exploring English teachers, but the transcriptionist just didn't get it right. I will also say Blake Poland's work on transcription is kind of like the gold standard. And Blake Poland's dissertation, she was part of a grant project herself, and they paid for people to transcribe, and they got the stuff back. And so part of Poland's work was going through the audio and comparing it to the transcription. And she realized that some of it was just like super just wrong. And she's like, what is going on? Long story shortened substantially, the transcriptionist decided that the interviews were just far too depressing and decided to lighten them up. And so just because you're paying someone to do a service, I mean, like, you're putting a lot of trust in somebody to basically produce your data for you. So my interaction in interviewing is very mindful of the fact that I'm going to have to transcribe this myself, and I don't want to hate myself in my mm-hms by the end. But anyway, so those are things for you to think about relative to the aftermath, because recording interviews is very common, but then you have to think about, like, what are you going to do with it, right? And transcription is also its own creative process. I mean, some of y'all know, because y'all been dragged through the mud relative to this soapbox of mine, but one of the things I have students do in one of the classes is, some of you know, like, Lizzo's song, Truth Hurts. I have them transcribe the first 30 seconds of that song. And rap's actually really useful for transcription because it follows a similar rhythm and cadence to natural speech. And then they realize that out of 24 students, there's 24 different transcriptions. And I'm like, so tell me more about how fact-based and how objective transcription is then, if we have 24 separate transcriptions going on in this one room. So just be aware, when you've got the audio is not the capital T truth in a Plato sort of mindset, Aristotelian truth, capital T. Other questions before you start working? Oh, sorry, Mona. Sorry.
So in addition to some of the
Thank
things
you.
that you mentioned, are there concessions or additional things you have to pay attention to if who you are interviewing is a child?
Oh my gosh, yes. Interviewing kids is, so first of all, the consent process for children is very different because you have to make sure that they're actually able to understand the consent process. You are a lovely human, I don't care what OFIC says. But the other part of it is when you're interacting with a kid, you can't talk to a kid for a long time. It's reasonable to think that an adult's going to be able to sit down and do like a 30 to even 2 hour long interview. That's actually reasonable, provided that it's something they want to talk about. But for a kid, like beyond 15 minutes, they start to get really squirrely, and I'm using that word very intentionally. But the other thing is, I will say that you have to be very mindful to make sure that what you're asking them is clear to them. That you're not leading them. Adults are able to just sort of be like, I'm going to answer this differently. But kids, by virtue of just the power dynamics that most of them have been acculturated to understand relative to adults, are very easily led. So you have to be very mindful of the ways that you're phrasing questions. I will also say that activity-based interviews work pretty well with kids, where you ask them to like do something, create something, draw something, illustrate something, and then talk about that. And that actually works pretty well with adults sometimes too, especially if it's a really difficult topic. So like for example, like one person that I know was doing research where she was asking women very specifically about, they had sexually transmitted infections or diseases. And so the question, the interview was basically like, how do you negotiate condom use when you have this STI or STD? And that's a very sensitive, difficult topic. And so she similarly had these people like do like timelines of like their sexual history, so that then they had like a concrete thing that they could go back to like physically touch and talk through if the interview became very uncomfortable. And so I will say that it works well for children to have them produce something that they then talk through, but it can also be very useful for adults, especially if you're asking them to work through something that's very complex or difficult or emotionally trying for them. It's pretty common. But make sure that whatever you're asking them to do makes sense. Don't just have them, because sometimes people will like want them to like produce an artifact that they can then use in their analysis, but then it's not really clear what that artifact was supposed to do. The participants should be very clear on what the function of that thing is. It should matter to them too. All right, I'm going to ask you all, we're going to see if you do this better than my doctoral students do. Try to put yourselves into groups of 3 or 4 people. It can't be more than 4 unless we just find that it's impossible mathematically to make it work otherwise. A pair can work, but 3 is ideal, 4 is perfectly acceptable, 5 is probably not going to work, and 2 is okay, all right? So let's figure that out, and then I'll give you instructions. The first one's only going to be about 15 minutes.
Mona, are you going to do it?
I think they need to adopt you. They need to adopt you.
Adopt me?
They need to adopt you. Yeah, well, one of y'all move over there, and then we're good. All right. Thank you, Bowden. Oh, you're not participating. Okay, that's fine. No, that's fine. That's fine. All right, so you stay. Oh, you're heading out. Okay. It's all right. So this will be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. You can be an observer. You don't have to participate in the interview at all. That's actually the role of the third person. Okay. It's fine. Definitely not going to make you do something you don't want or need to do. Is that what it is? Priya, do you want to be the interviewer or interviewee? You tell me what you want to do. Do you want to interview Ufuk or do you want to be interviewed? You want to be interviewee? Okay.
Oh my God, she's a challenge.
Okay, all right. One of you is going to be the interviewer. All right? I'm going to give you an interview question. Like, you don't have to, like, make up one for yourself. I got you. One of you is going to be the interviewer. One of you is going to be the interviewee. The other 1 or 2 are going to observe and take notes on the interaction. For the observer, your role is to think about what in this interaction seems to be productive, what seems to be working, and this is not even like what isn't working, it's more of just like what could be different. Because even if things are working, they can still be different, and then therefore would work differently. So, one person interviewer, one person interviewee, and then 1 or 2 of you, whoever's remaining, will be observers to take some jotted down notes relative to the interaction itself, okay? So figure out your roles. And if you were adamant about not doing one or the other, speak up for yourself. Self-advocate. Okay, everybody's got a role? going to have to behave.
You're the witness, right?
She's the observer, not a witness. There's not going to be a murder happening. She's the interviewee. You're going to interview her.
Yes.
You need to be mindful of your relationship with your interviewee. You need for her participation to happen. Okay, everybody's got a person, yeah? Okay. I want you, as an interviewer and interviewee, to decide on one of these three, because, let me explain why I'm giving you choices. If you were actually doing a research project, presumably these would be people who would enroll in your study. They would choose to participate. They would consent, right? So you were wanting to make sure that whatever you talk to them about is something they're willing to talk to you about, okay? So one of the options is to ask them to think of someone who inspires them and to tell you about that in as much detail as possible, okay? That's one option. Another is think of a moment when you were proud of yourself and describe that to me in as much detail as possible. The last one is think of a moment when you were afraid or that was very scary and talk to me about that in as much detail as possible. So interviewee kind of is the one that really gets to decide, but if for some reason the interviewer is like, I don't want to hear about a moment when you were scared because I'm not psychologically ready to deal with that, like I guess say that because I don't want to have like breakdowns here. But the interviewee needs to be the one in the driver's seat in terms of the choices, but the interviewer can self-advocate if necessary. All right? So pick a topic. Once you are in agreement on your topic and your phrasing of your interview question, because remember, it needs to be open-ended. You need to invite them to give you information, to tell you a story, to describe in as much detail as possible, whatever it is that they have in their head, and give them a moment to actually have it in their head. Once that's all in place, the observers are going to start just sort of paying attention to the interaction, how different choices and different interactions are mattering. And then you're just going to have the interview. And I'm only going to give you about 15 minutes total to do this. But that should give you time to at least ask one or two follow-up questions in addition to the question I'm giving you. Okay? Questions before you start not interrogating, because I feel like I need to qualify that for some people in the room.
We need to be like, kind of big one
It would be a good idea to just sort of get into the habit of thanking them for their time, asking them if it's okay to take notes. But if you forget, we kind of all understand that for right now, these are not like IRB sanctioned interviews. The other thing that I will say, and I'm glad you asked that question, Nancy, is this: if someone does disclose something that could be potentially problematic or uncomfortable outside of this space, please just like mind their privacy and just leave it here. We're just going to invoke the Vegas rule. And just if someone says something that could be potentially sensitive or misconstrued elsewhere, just leave it here. Okay? All right, other questions? That was an important one. All right, figure out your topic/question. Remember, interviewer, what your topic/question is, because your follow-ups need to pertain to that and advance that sort of questioning, okay? All right? Ready to go.
Did you say they may pertain to different content for different identities the interviewee has. Like, should I do it like as a doctoral student or as a woman?
You can decide that. You can decide that. Like, I mean, you can refine your research question if you want to. Make sure that she's okay with that. But if you're both on board, yeah, you can narrow it, refine it.
Yeah. Okay.
you know, we meet, but then the signatures are not meetings and come back and then we're sort of, particularly through the process, there was a previous one up to it. But then that decreased still wrestling sort of down and meeting on the effort, and it was becoming quite apparent that we were making mistakes while we were sitting there. I ended up as necessary, and I wasn't sure how that's capable of completing it. And it really was unpleasant to think about letting this person down and having that talk. Lay it just on the table and say, you know what, you really carry the water, you put a lot into this. And I also know the value of it. And then probably 2 or 3 talks that were 2 hours subject. And each time I was so intimidating that I didn't think I could carry it and so actually having that process. And then just agreeing. And then as soon as the agreement was bought and it was on the table, this is the way I should pay the past. So, yeah, probably pretty scared having that conversation. Sort of, I guess the scary part is anticipating the moment it's just laid down. And this is it, we're going to have to say no and everything. And the unknowing what where is how often operational speaking. I'm hoping that it would other things
I'm going to give you about 1 more minute to start finding an end to your interview.
I remember the
find a stopping point.
Doing what I can.
Good breaks. I say good breaks. She's a little bit of a cheater. She has taken like Qual 1, Qual 2. A little bit of a cheater. She's been trained. She's been trained. Okay, those of you who were observers, it's now your turn to talk. These sorts of interviews typically will go, you'll usually have an interview protocol of around 4 to 6 actual questions that are then supplemented by follow-up questions like you just did. And with those 4 to 6 interview protocol questions and then the follow-up questions, these interviews typically run anywhere from 45 to 180 minutes. Most of my interviews typically run around the 2-hour mark. And it's just very much an exercise of being attuned to what's being said to you and paying attention. It requires active listening, which is a skill that we all have as humans, but that you refine through practice. And I mean, jokingly, I was saying, because you were saying like Nancy had lots of follow-up questions, and I'm like, well, I mean, she's a little bit of a cheater because she has had like multiple qual classes. Nancy has endured multiple courses with me, but it's a skill that you work on and you refine. I suspect some of you you maybe were a little rusty, but you fell right back into it because I know some of you well from various courses. But this is a skill set that, just like anything else, you get better at the more you do it. And the more you do it, the higher quality your follow-up questions become. And I will say that some of you probably had this sense of like, oh my God, what am I going to ask next? That fades away as you do this more because you become far better equipped at just being attuned to and listening and being prepared. And your note-taking becomes more intentional as well. It's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get. Okay? So with those thoughts in mind, for those who are observers, what works really well? Because I have no doubt that many things did work really well. And then what are some things that potentially could work differently? Because one thing I want you all to be very aware of is that every interaction and every choice that you make in an interview situation does have an effect. It can be a really minor one, but it has an effect. One of my favorite things to do in the interviewing course is to show clips of like professional interviewers where things go super sideways. And so then the question becomes like, what is the interviewer doing to facilitate that happening, even if it was unintentional? And so the choices you're making really do shape the way that you interact with people. And it shapes the quality of the data that you therefore collect, okay? So observers, what did you note? What was noteworthy? And then after the observers have talked, I'd like for the interviewer to then sort of reflect on and maybe share briefly, like, what were some of the things that were a little more challenging than they might have been or could have been, or what was something that you were glad that you did or you wish you had done in retrospect, okay? Questions? Okay, all right, observers, the floor is yours. You finally get to talk. With your table. Sorry, I was very unclear. It was very unclear. My apologies. With your table, and then we'll talk together. My apologies.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Good.
Mona brought these. I have nothing to do with these.
That is a great idea. Next time you put the snacks.
Yeah.
Trying to listen and trying to
There was a recording. If a recording was going on, you probably would have had more eye contact, sure, right? Because you.
Y'all want a couple more before I move them?
Delicious, thank you.
I'm gonna bring the chocolate ones over here.
I thought the two that you asked were really good.
You're usually the one with snacks. Give you about one more minute. One more minute.
This is obviously, it's a very high skill. How does that make you feel?
I think they do. Oh, wait, I didn't pick mine up yet. Sorry. I didn't know we had a time.
Yeah? Who was the interviewer?
I was the interviewer.
I like it.
Because, you know, last time when I was interviewing, I cried. I didn't want to set myself up for that mistake.
So you were immediately like, I will interview. Here,
A
y'all.
lot of information. Thank you.
Yeah.
Project, like you. And I wanted to see your face.
Make sure you let the interviewer have some chat too. Y'all want any more? Yeah.
I thought your eye contact and the question.
Okay, if you haven't heard from the interviewer following the observer's feedback, let them chat now.
I told you.
Okay, all right. Find a stopping point. Okay. Based on your you who were watching the interview, what were some things that were noteworthy?
There's somebody down next to
All right, Basin. Ulfik will tell you when you're talking too much, I have no doubt.
I'm here.
Yeah, that's right, Bria's here too. She can tell you to hush.
Couple of things about the interview that I observed. The first thing that I mentioned was the way that they interact, the body language. So one thing that I myself try to pay attention a lot when I'm doing interview, face-to-face interview, that's just for face-to-face, not online.
Sure, online interviews are a different animal.
So the body language and eye contact. So when the interview was responding, I noticed that the interviewer is head down, taking a lot of notes and probably long notes, and that's good. One side of it is that I'm listening, the other side is that I'm cutting the connection on eye contact. At the same time, I noticed that when the interview is taking long notes, the interviewer is taking long notes, the interviewer is looking at the other side of it. So the gaze is somewhere else, probably not putting something from the memory or the moment. So that's
Lots of nodding around the room I'm seeing.
That's one thing, and the other thing is that the follow-up questions were amazing. So they picked the first question, inspiration, right in the middle of the conversation. I don't know. She told me that was a kind of counseling question as well. So your definition of inspiration, and that led to more thought, more information, and then and this is exactly what I do with my own.
It sure is.
And
Right, pause button. Okay, so you used your background relative to counseling to amend the interview a little bit. You also amended the question a little bit too. How did you change the question?
Those questions, they were too broad for qualitative interviewing.
I'm kind of proud of you. I feel like you've been well trained.
Someone who inspires you as a woman, as a doctoral student, as a, let's say, transgender individual, or as a foreign national, that would...
So you use an identity element to narrow the way that they would conceptualize that question.
What my agenda is.
Yeah.
I wanted to make it narrower to,
Yes.
to ask a meaningful question.
And that's also a good use of interviewing. If you're asking identity-based questions, survey instruments are often the way that people will initially begin to collect this sort of data, because it's very easy to ask identity-based questions because they indicate various demographics with which they identify. But interviews are a really good way to then have identity-based conversations. And so a lot of times if you have identity-based research of any kind, because yours is identity-based in many respects, Bazad, interviews are a really good way to get that information, because a lot of times it's far easier for people to just simply talk about how who they are is relevant to a particular issue. And it could be anything under the sun. It could be who they are as a teacher. It could be how they engage as a student. It could be how they ended up being incarcerated. It could be anything. But identity-based research is generally pretty predisposed to work well in interviewing situations, simply because of exactly that thing.
And also the identity of the interviewer.
Yes. Is a huge thing for sure. And so, some of you have had some pretty extensive qualitative coursework, and so there's a lot of reading that happens across those courses where we explore more explicitly the ways that interviewer identity really does matter. And there are moments when interviewers are not mindful of that identity mattering in a space. There are moments when interviewers become aware of the identity mattering because the interviewee says so. And so there's one that I use pretty regularly. It's by Juanita Johnson Bailey, and she's specifically interviewing. She was my supervisor at Georgia. She's the director of women's studies there, and she was setting up a classroom to get ready to teach. And she's like a distinguished endowed chair professor. She's like a big freaking damn deal, and she's setting her classroom up. and someone came in and assumed she was the custodian because she's a woman of color, and it just super pissed her off. And so she's just like, I'm gonna do some research on this, right? But so what she was doing was working to engage with women of color who work within the academy. But when she would sit down with them, some of these women, because Juanita's very light-skinned, would decide that she wasn't black enough. They would ask her questions about like what sorority she had been a member of, and Juanita had grown up in a very working-class family and had not joined a sorority, and so they would decide, well, clearly you're not like me. And so one of her most, I think, powerful articles is looking very specifically at the ways that these interviewees decided that although Juanita had worked very deliberately to try to make sure that she and the interviewees would have similar sorts of points of interaction and experience, the interviewees decided that they did not share those experiences. And so that was it was a very interesting and very vulnerable sort of reflection for her to engage with as a researcher. But it's important in qualitative interviewing because who you bring to the table is who you are. And you don't really have a whole lot of control over how interviewees decide that does or doesn't matter in a space. There are lots of moments where like white researchers will work to try to interview, for example, like indigenous children, and the kids are like, nah, not gonna happen, thanks white person. And then the interviewers are like, I don't understand what's happening, and it's like, well, not like there's nothing you're doing, it's just who you are. You can have the best interview protocol in the entire world, but if the interviewee decides that they're not gonna engage with you, they're not gonna engage with you. And there's another one that I think you read in Qual 2, for those of you who've taken the class, where it's these two white women. One interviews women of color who have been incarcerated, and the other interviews, do y'all know what junior league is? I actually didn't know what that was until I went to college. And I was like, oh. But so another one interviews very affluent white women who are in this like junior league sort of space, and the article is them reflecting on the ways that like their identities either allowed them entry into a particular group because they assumed that she was like them because she looked like them, dressed like them, talked like them, or these other interviewees who were incarcerated are like, you're not like me, you're like this like professor researcher type person, and like I'm stuck in prison. And in many cases, unjustly sentenced because of the racist justice system. And so these two women were comparing and contrasting their two experiences. And it wasn't anything that they had explicitly done relative to their interactions. It's just they brought baggage of who they were, and it shaped how the people interacted with them. So that's something, that is an advantage that surveys offer that interviews messy up, if you will, because survey instruments don't necessarily like unmask the researcher. Interviews necessarily do, even if it's online. Okay, so those are really, really good points. And then you had another point you were going to make, I thought. Okay, all right, go ahead, Andrea.
In relation to what you both were talking about, I think retrospectively, I was the interviewer.
Mm-hmm.
So we stuck with the first one, and the only change that I made to that question was tell me about someone who inspires you.
Mm-hmm.
And that was still it wasn't pointed enough because he answered it wonderfully, but I couldn't come up with like a direction to where I could pinpoint what inspiring means. Like that's where that question came from. So it was like I was trying to keep him on track and talk about something that's inspiring, but if the first question you asked is way too broad, it was hard for me to...
Which was the issue that you had. I will say this is a perfect example of you did exactly what she asked you to do. You answered her question. And so then you realize, like, you can't be like, all right, interviewee, you're not answering good. That's not a good job. You can't do that, right? And so then you have to modify what you yourself are doing. Because at the end of the day, and I say this to students all the time, at the end of the day, the only thing you have any control over, ultimately, because you can't control the technology, because it may decide it's just not going to cooperate. You can't control the interviewee because they're a different person. You can't sometimes control, like, the climate of the room or the noise level or whatever. The only thing that you ultimately can control at the end of the day is you. And so that's a good, just intuitive response is like, this is not actually what I'm trying to learn about. I need to edit what I am doing and what I am saying. I don't even know. There's like all three of you over here. Go ahead.
So, about the identity
Mm-hmm.
to the person, especially the interviewee.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes if we give someone, or if you remind them of their role, or give them a specific for example, as a woman, as a grad student, you also give them some responsibility as well, right? So for example, as a graduate student, you should be professional, and then it will affect their responses, right? So is it good to always remind them of their role, like human identity, or try to treat them as a human without any?
It depends. It depends is the answer. And a lot of you know, like, I actually don't give very straightforward responses to questions. It depends. If your research purpose is to understand a particular identity element, then it's almost going to be necessary that you ask them explicitly. Because this goes back to this experience over here. They will give you exactly what you ask for almost always. And if you're not asking them about explicit components that you're trying to understand relative to your research purpose, they're not going to just naturally address them necessarily. And so you're going to have to ask. I do think that it is useful, however, to be very mindful of how that could be difficult for them or be risky for them. I'm always very mindful anytime that I interview someone and they are positioned relative to a student identity and then I'm a faculty member, that's a very complex dynamic. And so a lot of times I actually will ask the student pretty directly, like, would they prefer to have another graduate student interview them and me just not be present? Sometimes students will say, yes, that's a great idea. Other times students will be like, no, I want you to interview me. But I try to upfront acknowledge, like, look, like, I know that this is potentially difficult for you. And so if at any point in time you want to stop or you want to reframe something, then know that you have, like, that's your right. And I know that there are other people within the college that are pretty dismissive of member checking. And if you're not familiar with that concept, member checking is where after you've concluded like an interview or a focus group or whatever, you follow up with the participants to share with them, for example, the transcripts. And there are people who don't necessarily love that approach to research because it slows everything down. I've had participants be very adamant about what I understood to be very small, just really ticky changes. And it would really frustrate me because it's like, you know, I have an editor who's very interested in this paper, but I can't get it back to them because, like, you keep wanting to change these little bitty small details. But at the end of the day, like, I'm getting the benefit of a publication. They're potentially at risk for unemployment. They're potentially at risk for someone identifying them. Like, the risk is always greater for them than it is for me. And so even if it's frustrating, like, it's important for me as a researcher to do member checking, to give them the right to then not only have some say in terms of what we are or aren't going to engage with relative to the interview, but after the interview. Because there have been times when, for example, like, a participant will say, I used this phrase and I'm really embarrassed that I used it. Like, I know better now. Or I said this, but now that I'm thinking about it, everybody's going to know who I'm talking about, and, like, that can't be public. And those are things that don't affect me, but they, in many respects, directly affect them. And so the first thing is, like, you engage with identity-based questioning, even if it's difficult, if that's the research topic, but there's lots of ways that you can try, not to mitigate it because that's not the right word, but at least to acknowledge it, to honor the difficulty of their participation potentially, and also to give them some level of say and power in terms of how that research gets used in the world. And anytime I publish from research, I share that with participants. Most of the time they think it's really cool because, like, they'll know, like, this is me, like, because it's a pseudonym. And so they'll think it's really cool, and they'll even, like, tell other people, like, you know, hey, look, honey, I got you know, right? And I'm just like, well, now we're not anonymous. But then there are other times when it's important to them to know that this is about to become a public thing. Right? Because they want to make sure that how they're being represented is not detrimental or dangerous for them.
Especially if it's successful.
For sure. And I mean, and because a lot of my research, as Mona said at the very beginning, because a lot of my research is relative to, like, genders and sexualities, and I do a lot of my research within the Deep South and the Bible Belt, like, there are teachers who are literally breaking the law by addressing LGBTQ topics in schools. Like, they're literally breaking the law. And some of them are very mindful of the ways that they're represented on the page because particular principals could identify them. And then they lose their job. That's a very different level of stakes than it is for me. For me, it's like, tenure promotion stuff. For them, it's like literally like, I could go to jail, I could lose my job, I could like lose my house, my car. So yeah, but there are ways to be responsible and mindful when you engage in identity-based research. There are also ways to be really slipshod and sloppy and irresponsible. And people do both. Mona, what was your question?
I think it was.
Okay. That's a talent I have.
I think in relation to that, also when you're talking about identities, how do you go about ensuring that you are not asking them identity questions for them to speak for all of the people
Sure.
that have that identity? Like, I'm not going to be like, as a woman, tell me about sexism. Like, more so, like, how do you recreate that?
Yeah. This is one of the reasons that it's really important for people to be trained as researchers, is because this is something that over the course of being trained to, for example, interview well, you realize sometimes that you're predisposed to sort of ask those kinds of questions. Because we'll ask those sorts of questions like in social settings, right? Like I will make very sweeping, broad statements regarding like political parties or affiliations or whatever, quite unapologetically sometimes. But like part of what you do relative to becoming a practiced researcher is you begin to realize that the ways that you're framing questions, because like your questions were very much about like them telling you about a moment when they felt a particular way. And so that's part of it is making sure that the way, because again, participants will answer what you ask them. And so making sure that you're asking them specifically about their experiences. And this goes back to the very beginning of the little PowerPoint that I did. The function of qualitative research is to understand like small scale individual experiences. You're not trying to generalize broadly. So that's the first answer to your question, is that making sure that you're asking questions and you have research questions that are mindful of the fact that if you're doing interviews, your goal is not to try to generalize to a group, because that goes back to like the previous thing. Qualitative research is not equipped to do large-scale generalizable research. That's not its function. That's not its job. Quant does that quite well. Qual doesn't do that at all. And so that's part of it. And then the other part of it is if you realize you're doing that in an interview, because especially if you're doing longitudinal research and you get really comfortable with interviewees and they get really comfortable with you, sometimes you and or they may start making more generalizable statements because it's very much more like a social situation than like an actual like research interview, right? It feels much more comfortable, much more social. If you realize that's happening, then like part of your responsibility as an interviewer is to be like, oh my God, like I realized like I asked you this question and that just really wasn't a very fair question for me to ask because I'm asking you to speak for an entire group of people or whatever. The other part of that though is that even if you do all that right, like if you get all that exactly right, what I see a lot of times is people will do the interviews, gold star on your forehead, but then they'll start writing up their findings and then they start speaking for like entire groups of people. And it's like you can't have an interview be these findings that now allow you to talk for an entire group of human people and an entire human experience. And that's pretty common. I would love to say with novice researchers, but I think it's just common period, because gosh, every time I review for a journal, I'm just like, stop! And this one's I catch myself doing it too. Like I'm not like immune to that, right? Because we all want our research to be like really important and matter. And so then you start making these grandiose claims, and it's like, Qual, that's not Qual's function. That's not Qual's job. That's not what it's here to do. What were you going to say?
Is it a wise thing to share?
This is a very loaded question already. Go ahead. You're lucky that I love you. Go ahead.
Your research agenda with the participants.
Oh.
One question would be like, should I mean, I know it's related to, again, me as an interviewer or as a researcher, but I'm interested in your, let's say, experiences, so that we can talk about the experience, or life story, or like thoughts, aspirations, future plans, whatever. So if I do that, then we can focus more easily, I guess. But if I do that, I may miss some other things that I, may not know or may encounter if I do that.
Yeah.
So, is it a wise thing, or do you think? Where do you think I should?
I think it depends. One thing I'm going to say, and this is not necessarily going to be a satisfying answer for you, but it is going to be one that I think will make sense to you. There's not a single apolitical move that you can make when you're doing interviewing. Like, none of it is without consequence. Not sharing it with them is going to have an effect on the interaction. Sharing it with them is going to have an effect on the interaction, right? Sharing part of it with them is going to have an effect on the interaction. Like, it's not like there's any sort of like neutral. Like, there is no like neutral good in qualitative research. It's all in some form, shape, and fashion going to shape the interaction because it's people-based. It's solely people interacting with people. And so I think that instead of like, is it wise or is it unwise, it's more a matter of like, what are the potential, especially unintended consequences of doing or not doing relative to what your research purpose is. And I think part of that too, relative to Mona's question about interviewing children, part of the question becomes who are you interviewing and how useful or unuseful is it for them to know the purpose. Because I will say that a lot of my research involves teachers. These are college-educated professionals. They are in a profession that has been de-skilled. They feel disrespected. And so a lot of times my consent process will involve me explaining to them exactly what it is I'm trying to learn, why it is that I care about it. And so then like they have, because a lot of teachers are constantly asked to like do this intervention, do this thing, they're observed, they're evaluated, there's test scores, whatever. And so one of the things that I want to do, given that that's my population, is make it clear to them that my research is not just more of the same. Right? And so for me, it's worthwhile, it is wise, to use your word, to explain to them what the purpose of my research is, what I'm hoping to learn with them and from them. But there are also situations where it's overkill. It's too much information and they're not necessarily going to be particularly interested in it. There's also moments when interviewees will feel like what you're asking them about just doesn't apply to them. And those can be really baffling moments because like you send out calls, you have participants enroll in your study, and then you're like, you signed up for this, but now you're telling me that like this doesn't apply to you. Like, why are you here, right? But sometimes it's because of the way that you're interpreting and explaining things to them. Or to go back to this group over here, sometimes it's a matter of the way that you're interpreting the meaning of a word versus the way that they're interpreting the meaning of a word. And so, like there were detained youth that were being asked about ways that racism had been a factor in them becoming basically incarcerated as youth. And a lot of these youth, when it got into, because there's this explanation of like, this is the purpose of the study, blah, 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 blah. Retrospectively, I think we wouldn't have done that. Because when the interviews started, they engaged with racism as this very historical concept. And initially just refused, like, no, racism has nothing to do with like me being here. I just made bad decisions. When we started to ask them questions instead about like, well, were there moments when your white peers were treated differently than you were? Then it was like the floodgates open, like, yeah, totally. But for us, it was a matter of they understood racism as this very abstract, historicized notion, and so giving them all that information really just was not productive and useful. It was a waste of their time and their energy, and I think that in many respects it set them up to initially believe like the interview was just going to be like a history lesson of sorts for them. And so, we've learned from that. We'll do better in the future. But sometimes, and this is not a satisfactory answer at all, but sometimes you don't know until after you've basically like let the lightning out of the bottle because you can't put it back in. Sometimes you learn after the fact that like this wasn't the right move. And you learn from that and you move forward. And I will say as like a side note, and it seems like a tangent, but it's important, when students in the qualitative research classes, for example, like in Qual 1 they do individual interviewing, Qual 2 they do focus group interviewing, the students actually don't get a grade on the interviews themselves. They don't get a grade on the individual interview, they don't get a grade on the focus group interview, they get grades on other assignments that are related to the doing of those things. And one of the reasons for that is because pedagogically, philosophically, the point is to learn from the experience and to reflect on it, not to necessarily do it right. It's what did you learn? How would you do it differently? And that doesn't stop. I've been doing interviewing for years now. I get paid pretty freaking good money to do interviews for different agencies and people, and I still do it wrong. But part of my job is to learn from that and figure it out. Good.
So one question, whether it's a class or whether it's a government department you're interviewing people on, if you're doing interviews on individual people,
yeah,
and they're part of a group of 100 people in some department or something. What, if anything, do you do to ensure, because the interviews take place, you probably don't sit there and do 8 interviews in a day. They take place over time. What do you do to ensure that one interviewee is not influencing another future interviewee?
Oh, you can't. No, I mean, so what you do, the right answer, I'm going to give you the right answer, then I'm going to give you the real answer. How about that? So the right answer is that you, as part of the consent process, you review with them importance of privacy, importance of confidentiality. I will say that if you do focus groups, because a lot of agencies like focus groups because they're cost effective. You get a lot of information all at one time, right? And they take less time over time. Because you can 8 people at once versus having to do 8 hours of interviews. You can't ever guarantee confidentiality and privacy in a focus group because I can't control what those people do when they walk out that door. And so that's part of what you do as part of the consent process. As the right thing to do is to remind them it's important that we honor one another's privacy. It's important that if people say things here that it remains here. But I don't have any control over that. And it's the same in many respects to an individual interview. And so I've done interviews like that, and it's very common for me to have Mona come in. I talk to her, you interview, whatever, you leave. Sabrina comes in. It's like, oh yeah, my friend Mona said that she talked to you, and you're really nice, and this is going to be great, whatever. And then Ufa comes in. He's like, yeah, I think this is kind of dumb. I have to be here. I talked to my friends, and they already told me the kind of stuff that you're going to ask me. And I mean, and so the real answer is, you're not going to be able to control it because, it goes back to that humans are always X factors, right? And that's true no matter your data collection method. And some of you know, my survey story about the syphilis. You've heard that story. I'll tell the rest of you later. It's hilarious. But anytime that you involve humans in your data collection, even if it is through a survey instrument, you are relying entirely and utterly on humans. And we're just not reliable. And so you can't control it. The best that you can do is to try to acknowledge it and mitigate it. And so I will say that, for example, if I'm in an interview situation and Sabrina comes in and she's like, oh yeah, my friend Mona said blah, 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 blah. One of the things that I typically do is say oh, I'm so glad that you've had the opportunity to have this conversation with other people. I want to make sure that our interaction is one where you feel like this is something that's useful to you. And so trying to focus it back down to this is just you and me right now. And then if Ufa comes in and is I don't want to be here. It's a waste of my time. They already told me what you're going to ask me. It's dumb. It's I hate that you feel that way. I'm going to work diligently to try to make sure that our interaction is as meaningful and useful to you as it can possibly be. However, do keep in mind that you have the right to withdraw from this interaction at any point in time, right? It's one of those you just acknowledge and you're okay, because sometimes people just don't want to be there, and sometimes people are coming in and they're always they already told me what you're going to ask me, and I've already thought about my answers, and it's okay, all right. So the real answer is you have no control over that, but you can work, and I will say that if people come in and it's clear to me that someone else really has kind of shared with them, these are the interview questions that she asked me, I will try, even if unconsciously sometimes, I will try to reframe them or rephrase them so that it's not verbatim what they've already been told to expect, so that then they have to think a little more. But it's actually pretty common practice for some interviewers to share their interview protocol with participants prior to the interview so that then they have opportunities to think about those questions. And there are people who have concerns. It's well, yeah, but then they're going to come with prepared answers. And it's and sometimes that's not a bad thing. Sometimes depending on the topic that you're exploring with them, asking them to just come cold is not necessarily the best thing to do. It can be traumatizing, it can be damaging, it can be unproductive. And so there are certainly situations where them knowing the questions ahead of time could actually be quite productive, quite helpful for them. It's one of those, I tell students all the time, you can do whatever you want, but it's got to make sense. And that's qual. You can do whatever you want, but it's got to make sense. And so if you're going to share it with them ahead of time, why? If you're not going to share it ahead of time, why? As a parting gift, I will tell you my story about syphilis. Because you've heard it. Okay, so obviously, whenever I teach Qual 1, I typically have students that are just kind of begrudgingly I'm here because I have to be. And I'm I acknowledge that. I value your presence and I'm glad you're here. But one of the things that I set out to do very quickly is to emphasize the degrees to which human subjects-based research is always a dice roll. All right? Because you can't control what people are going to do. And there are often students who will invoke surveys and be like, yeah, but that's objective. They can just respond in their own time, whatever. And I'm like, let me tell you a story. So I used to be a high school teacher, and I loved it. It was amazing. And I taught in one of those schools. And because it was a high-need school, the kids always got yanked out of class to go take various surveys for like national data because they didn't need to be in class. Why should they be? And because I was a high school teacher, that was like the one class that every grade level and every diploma level had to take. So they would always pull them out of my class. And so they would take like surveys on like drug use, they would take surveys on like sexual behavior, you know, whatever. And so there was one day, they all got drug out of class to go take a survey on like sexually transmitted infections and diseases, okay? So they go, because there's one computer lab in the whole school, because that was reasonable. They go, they come back, I hear them coming around the corner because, you know, 40 teenagers in a pack make sound. And two of them get back, and their names were Savon and Markeith, and I will always love them and adore them, and I keep up with them on Facebook. And so they come into the classroom, you know what I'm talking about now, don't you? And they come in, and they sit down, and they pull out their book, and you know, whatever, and everything. And I hear Markeith say to Savon, "Ma'am, what'd you put for syphilis on the survey?" And Savon says, "I put I had it." And Markeith's like, "Man, you got syphilis?" And he says, "No, but somebody else in here probably does, and they lied about it, so I'm just helping them." So I'm just like, tell me more about your objective surveys, please. So anytime you got people involved, it's a mess. It's a mess. That's just the end of that. All right. Thank you so much for your time. And if you need to contact me, there is my contact information.
Qualitatively, you can. That's even worse. You have it there, okay.
Mona, you gonna close them out? I'll get them quiet.
Yeah, no, they're networking. That's more important than whatever I have to say.
Okay, let me get your. Okay.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes, totally. All right, Mona's gonna close us out.
Yes, I hate to break the networking because that's the point of this entire thing. So just one thing, I will be sending out an email with the feedback form. Here's why I really think it would help us. One, it would give us feedback, right? So people last time told us, let's not do it in this room, guys. Yes, you're right, technology is not best. So we're changing rooms, right? They've been giving us lots of good feedback, so we're gonna follow up on that. The other piece is, you get to thank the speakers if you wanted to write a note. So there is a piece in there, and then we'll put it all together, make a nice card, and give it to our speakers. That's something that I think is important, right? I think
That seems very Southern, doesn't it?
that you guys appreciate, you know, the event. So if you want to do that, that would also be all part of the survey. So please make sure you take the time to do that. And please take some snacks to go. Dr. Shelton made it much easier, right? Snacks on the table.
I grew up in the Baptist church. I know how to serve food.
And here's the talk for next week. Again, this is an ongoing thing. Oh, the other feedback that we got was, don't call it a brown bag. You're right. So this is methodology. It's going to take longer than 1 hour to cover. So we're going to take out the brown bag piece out of it. It's just going to be a methodology series. This is the next one on Wednesday. So
And these are amazing humans, Dr. Cook and Dr. Wynn.
so please make sure if you're interested to stop by. It'll be great for 2027, as you know, with technology.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
All right.
Please network.
Okay.